You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Dr. George H. Nash is the epitome of a gentleman and a scholar. He's an American historian whose work focuses on the presidency of Herbert Hoover and the conservative intellectual movement here in the United States. His first book, published in 1976, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945, set the template in a lot of ways for how we tell the history of the conservative movement. And even though 1976 was quite a while ago, it is still in a lot of ways the gold standard, a foundational work in this field. Longtime listeners of the podcast know that I cite Dr. Nash very often and this book, as I think it does a good job helping us understand the movement that Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley, Frank Myers, and so many others worked to put together. I've had Dr. Nash on the podcast before to talk about the history of conservatism, and most recently to talk about the presidency of Herbert Hoover. And I'm glad to welcome him back in this updated conversation on American conservatism. 1976 was a while ago. A lot has changed since then. But Dr. Nash is still sharp as a tack, and I think the listener will soon find very insightful with where we've come as conservatives and where we may be going. So with that, I give you my conversation with Dr. Nash.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Dr. Nash, I am thrilled that at last the stars have aligned between schedules and technical difficulties for the two of us to virtually meet again. It has been too long, sir, but it is great to have you back on the Saving Elephants program.
Well, thank you very much. I've been delighted to have this opportunity. I do recall our one or two previous conversations in the past during your 8 years, as I understand now, as a podcaster. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, 8 years in the podcast industry makes me ancient because this is a pretty new medium, but I've been loving it. Have great opportunities to talk to people such as yourselves that were in a lot of ways the movers and thinkers behind the movement. And, you know, as I forewarned you in the green room, I do want to talk a bit. I want to use your book, the Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. I've always maintained it's a wonderful book with a really hard to remember title because it's long. But I think it is one of the best. I have always used it as a blueprint to try to chart the conservative history in the United States that I'm trying to posit, sort of a Burkean, Kirkian, if you will, fusionist type conservatism, classical conservatism. And I think it is incredibly important and useful to that degree. But one of the things I think that's very interesting is there are individuals who have tangled with your work and others. And sometimes they'll pay tribute to you saying they love the book, they think it's a great book, but they would say, but you know, and it's there in the title, right? The conservative intellectual movement. They would say, well, there's a lot about American conservatism that you could take that word intellectual out and you could write a completely different book. Yeah. And what Dr. Nash is writing about, as important as it is, William F. Buckley and Frank Meyer and Wilmore Kendall, they were just a tiny pinprick in the backdrop of the larger American right in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And in a lot of ways, the only reason we're even talking about them is because Ronald Reagan becomes president in the 80s, and that movement's kind of ascendant, which for the listener who's unaware, one of the things that's amazing about your book is how prescient it was. You know, it was originally written up through the 70s before we even knew there would be a Reagan Revolution. And so I'm saying that, and I'm sure you're familiar with Matthew Continetti's more recent The Right, 100-Year War. There are other books such as Radio Right by Paul Matsko that you may or may not have heard of. I think it's a wonderful book. It talks about the radio personalities that existed prior to Rush Limbaugh, kind of this proto-Rush Limbaugh type. Yes. And both of them tangle with this whole issue of what does it mean to be conservative if you take the intellectual part out, in a sense. And so I guess I'm kind of curious here. You start your book in 1945 because it's, I think, in a way, a response to FDR's The Great Society, kind of how we understand conservatism. You know, Matthew Continetti starts it around the Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge era, because that, to them, they weren't conservative, they were normal, right? They were like, we got rid of that progressive era, the Woodrow Wilson. That was kind of weird. Let's just get back to normal. So I know it's maybe too big a question to begin with, but I'm going to try anyways. How much of this story depends on your starting point? like, if you start in the Harding Coolidge era, it seems like you end up writing a very different book than if you start in 1945. And can we even understand intellectual conservatism if we start somewhere else, or is it necessarily we have to think of this as, say, a post FDR movement?
Well, I've been accused of having somehow loaded the dice by choosing that as a date. I assure the listeners that I had no such intent, nefarious intent. Remember, I was a graduate student when I started this, and the dissertation, and one always asked, well, what is the starting point? 1945 seemed to have justification for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Second World War was ending, and people were turning back to think about domestic politics in the United States after the 4 years since Pearl Harbor. Also is the year that FDR died, and in some sense it seemed that the New Deal period, whatever you think of its ideas and its policy consequences, the New Deal period was over. And it's been called, I think, by one historian, year zero, especially for Europeans trying to pick up the pieces literally from the devastation of the Second World War on that continent. So I thought that, and as I looked at it, explored the topic, I realized that there was no conservative movement in the United States. The people who we would now think of as conservatives, or maybe they would call themselves classical liberals, whatever their self-designation, they were pretty much pessimistic. There was Albert J. Nock, who said he was a superfluous man. He titled his Memoirs of a Superfluous Man. So he was just outside of history, and as Buckley put it 10 years later, William F. Buckley, National Review, when it was founded in 1955, was standing athwart history, yelling, stop. So There was a sense that there was nothing there. There were scattered voices of protest, and a sense that the war had been won by the New Deal government, if you will. All the Americans pretty much were supported, naturally. But it was Roosevelt who was the commander-in-chief. And in addition to that, there was a sense that in Britain, things were turning to the left. Churchill was voted out. The Tories were voted out. Labor was coming in, and they sang a radical song on the floor of Parliament, the triumphant Laborites, when they took their seats in Parliament. And of course, farther east, Russia, communism was establishing its hold over much of Central and Eastern Europe. So it didn't look very good for the kind of world that had existed, let's say, in the 1920s. So for all of those reasons, it seemed that it was appropriate to begin with an examination of how these, what I called scattered voices of protests, became more articulate, discovered one another, started to write books challenging the zeitgeist, if you will. And I could have started it, someone suggested that once, I start with 1933. Well, Hoover leaves office, the New Deal sweeps in. That would have been defensible, I think, in one way. But as I tried to demonstrate in the book, there were streams of thought that are not simply antipathy to the New Deal in an economic sense. I'm speaking of the cultural, religious traditionalists. And then you have the whole issue of the Cold War, the incipient Cold War, not yet called that, but the struggle to define the shape of the world as a bipolar world, with the Soviet Union being the other dominant power. So that was an issue. Communism was around. The Soviet Union was around in 1933, but it didn't have the centrality to the narrative or to the future, or perceived that way, in 1933. So it seemed to me that if you think of conservatism as not being a single ideology or a set belief system, but as a confluence of several different currents of thinking, all reacting against the left. That was a commonality, really, but reacting in different ways to what they saw as the excesses or the threats from the left, whether economic or spiritual or geopolitical and so on. So if you look at it that way, it seems to me that there was no conservative movement that could simply be revived now that the war was over. There were conservative voices, Coolidge, and in certain ways Hoover, especially as he defended himself against the New Deal and saw himself in his later years as a crusader against collectivism, to use his own term of self-reference. So that you could find voices, and you can certainly find certain themes. I think one thing that Matt Continetti does very well is to emphasize this kind of tension between the elitist kind of formulation and the populistic sentiment back and forth, and you have that kind of tension that flares at different times, and that's one way of telling the story. And again, I just to explain the origins of the dissertation and how I set it up this way, I was writing this as an intellectual history dissertation with an outstanding intellectual historian, Donald Fleming, as my advisor. And there had been a fair amount of social history about the radical right and the extremists and so forth, the Birch Society and other such. There was a kind of grassroots right existing, but it didn't have much intellectual prominence or respectability. It had some votes in Congress, it had some people at the grassroots and so forth, but that was not the phenomenon that I was seeking to identify. I would argue that as time went by, people like Buckley, Kirk, and Meyer, and Milton Friedman, Hayek, certainly with The Road to Serfdom, all contribute to this intellectualization, if you will, of conservatism, getting intellectual voices. And I'm glad I just mentioned Hayek, because in 1944 he wrote what became a sensational book, a controversial book that not only stirred up people in Great Britain, where he was then living, but also in the United States. His book was widely circulated over here, and it was printed in excerpted form in the Reader's Digest and so forth. So there was a period then when that was another reason for saying something's happening about 1945, but it's stirrings at that point. Right. It's not a whole grassroots movement suddenly growing up again after this detour, if you will, of the 1930s and mid-40s. So that's how I perceived it that way. And there are certainly other ways to tell a story. And I think what Continetti is trying to show is that there is a kind of a conservatism out there that did not simply disappear totally. And it's true, in the 30s, it was very much on the defensive and scattered. But in Congress, there were voices, and the conservative coalition of Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans really started to coalesce in 1938 and 39. So that's slightly a pre-war phenomenon. So all of those activities are there. And I remember now, just remember something that's in my book. Someone asked Robert Taft, this famous senator, and really the intellectual leader, if you will, of congressional Republicans before his death in 1953, what he thought, I think, of Russell Kirk's book, The Conservative Mind, or something like that. And he said, well, you remind me of James Thurber's book. Thurber was a noted humorist of the day, called Leave Your Mind Alone. And Taft was saying, look, I'm a politician. I'm not here to be a philosopher and so on. But I think what the intellectuals are trying to do is say, look, you've got to approach the problems at that level. And National Review, of course, became the principal medium for doing that for some period.
There's a lot there to chew on. And it's interesting you had mentioned that you've been accused of loading the dice by starting with 1945. I think it's very defensible why you would, and especially for all the reasons you'd given. But what's as you were saying that, what comes to my mind is almost anyone that does a historical / philosophical work is always picked apart for the starting point, right? We have to pick, Russell Kirk starts with Edmund Burke, but could he have started with Aristotle or a little or Socrates? I mean, or a little earlier. I'm reading I'm just now getting around to reading Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver, who charts his at sort of everything went wrong with William of Ockham in what, the 14th century or something. And of course, famously, the Straussians go back often to Machiavelli or some of their other bugaboos. But I think it's the limitation of human nature. You have to pick a starting point. Unless you want to write some volume so long nobody's ever going to read it. I guess we can go back to antiquity or something to that effect. But on the other side of that, you kind of have to pick an endpoint. Now, naturally, you picked one at the time you'd written in the 70s when it ends, and then you update it later.
Yes.
But I'm kind of wondering now, because I think one of the advantages, we both mentioned Continetti's book, and you're right. I think one of the brilliant things about Continetti's book is he demonstrates there's a sort of, I'm going to call it proto-MAGA or proto-Trumpism that had always been there for 100 years on the right. It never went away. It was in the background, and it had various forms, and some of those forms I think would probably be more honorable or dishonorable than others. And I think he even makes the point that in a sense Ronald Reagan represented a sort of populism, but not in the same type that maybe a Donald Trump would. But I think that's kind of an interesting, as wonderful as your book is about 1945, I think it does leave us today with, okay, but now what? It explains what happened in the 80s and maybe through the 90s. But what happened? What the 1980s was 40 years ago.
Yes.
Where do we bridge the gap between what happened then? Because I think there's a lot of classical conservative, Burkean, Kirkian conservatives, such as, I'm not trying to implicate you too much, but say such as ourselves, that really want to tell the story as if the history ended in the 1980s, or at least the early 90s. And it didn't, unfortunately. It kept going. and we have to reconcile with that. And we have to, okay, well, where do we go from here? So where do you bridge the gap between, let's say, where your wonderful book leaves off and then where it leaves us today?
Well, in some of my later writing and some essays in a subsequent book of mine, a book of essays published in 2009 called Reappraising the Right, I address some of those questions, but in a more fragmentary manner. It's a collection of my essays, some unpublished, mostly published, and I take the story up to about that period. As I interpreted the arc of conservatism, ARC, not ARK, but the arc of conservative history, starting in 1945, I realized that what happened in 1989 and 1991, the collapse of the Eastern European Empire of the Soviet Union, and then the implosion of the Soviet Union itself, the effective end of the Cold War, at least against the Russian version of communism, that was a very decisive moment in history for a lot of reasons, but in this context of conversation, for conservatism, because it then meant it was an ending on a plane of accomplishment, of victory, and that victory oddly reduced the impulse of the constituent elements of the conservative movement: libertarians, traditionalists, neoconservatives, cold warriors, religious right or social conservatives, to take the most prominent components. It diluted the impulse to stick together, because during the Cold War, everyone had some common ground in opposing the evil empire in Moscow, as Reagan called it. But with the end of that external foe, the incentive or the requirement of staying together and being unified diminished. And what happened was that, to look at it from another angle, the Cold War period for conservatism, roughly from 1945 to the early 90s, was a period that, if you look at it, was dominated by two great ecumenical leaders, Buckley and Reagan. Now, they weren't ecumenical to every manifestation on the right and so on. There have been conflicts and disputes about all of that. But they were both people who tried to keep an alliance together. And Meyer, of course, was a theoretician who argued that the alliance was theoretically justified, and in fact, it was simply an articulation of premises that were embedded in the founding. That was his argument. Not everybody agreed with him, but there seemed to be a general agreement that the various components or factions belonged under the same tent. Well, that tent got buffeted once the Cold War ended, and there was what I call the sectarian temptation that's always present in any coalition, but it became more prominent, and that was the impulse to go it alone. And so you begin to see a proliferation, even before 1989, of other conservative media outlets, for example. And then particularly in the 90s and beyond is the extraordinary revolution in technology. The internet, obviously, what we call social media, all sorts of outlets. And many of those outlets were more populistic in the sense that it was easy to get access on talk radio. You call in and you give your opinion and so forth, and you're suddenly heard by millions of people. So the media that were dominant in conservatism, that evolved to be dominant in the 70s, or 60s, 70s, 80s, were mainly print media. Commentary magazine, when it turned from moderate left to toward the right, neoconservative outlet. National Review, I've mentioned, and the Weekly Standard, which started in the mid-90s, and so on. These were print media, and I find it interesting that when the Trump phenomenon came along in full blast in 2016 or so, the print media conservative establishment was pretty much critical. But it was the talk radio people representing that kind of communication who often were not entirely, not always, but mostly very supportive of Trump. So I think
National Review literally ran the against Trump issue when he first ran.
Yes, exactly. And it didn't seem to matter particularly because a lot of people had been exposed to Limbaugh and many others who had, and even though Limbaugh was a great friend of Buckley, by the way, and really admired, looked up to Buckley, and I think Buckley was intrigued by the Limbaugh phenomenon. He's this communicator through this particular medium. So I think that the end of the Cold War, plus the more or less simultaneous rise of new forms of mass media, undercut the coherence, the intellectual coherence or efforts at that had been dominant when you had the external foe to keep people from going off into the deep ends and become heretical. And what Meyer taught with fusionism and what the Cold War reinforced was that, as to use Ben Franklin's old expression, we've got to hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately. And some of that impulse of hanging together disappeared. And I don't recall the precise phrase that Charles Krauthammer had for it in the early 90s, but it was something like the democratization of mass media had set in. And this meant that the intellectuals writing for the magazines could still have a following, and some of them were speechwriters for congressmen. Newt Gingrich, Ph.D., was Speaker of the House, and so forth. There were all these networks and so on. But it meant that that the populistic, and I'm not using that in a pejorative sense, but just these popular, if you will, impulses of concern about whatever is happening in the society, that they're always there. It's sort of embedded in a democratic society that you're going to have some what I call mutterings, people discontented at one level or another, but it doesn't necessarily rise to organized expression very often. We can talk about that further if you like. So anyway, those were some of the reasons why I think things changed. And then for some time, there was this kind of afterglow of Reagan, and Reagan got Alzheimer's, and he was all the more sympathized with, in his declining years. And he really did define not only what it meant to be conservative for that period of his presidency, but also he defined a kind of style of discourse. And I like the term. I've used it myself. I'm not sure I originated it necessarily. Reagan was a kind of populistic libertarian in the sense that he believed in the wisdom of folks, and that they should not be managed unduly by a self-important elite. And Reagan had some choice quotations along that line, but it was a gentle kind of populism. He would criticize, but often it was abstract. He didn't personalize his enemies and call them names and so forth. So Reagan was saved, and I think part of his success, part of Buckley's success, was they both had a sense of humor, and they were both witty. So even people who disliked what they stood for had a hard time disliking them. So Reagan, could transcend. He was very skillful at that, and I do think that his use of wit and humor could define issues, but in a way that might irritate, but not unnecessarily antagonize or make haters out of his foes. So, and again, that's part of being a successful ecumenical leader. So Buckley and Reagan were key to that period. we lose that sense of common engagement that it's a conservative movement, is all these people united and so forth, more or less united, or at least a division of labors. We know the libertarians are going to concentrate on certain issues, and the right to life people and others, but that's a kind of useful, I would call, division of labor. But some of that ecumenical sensibility, or fusionist sensibility, as I've called it, diminished, partly because the need for it for ecumenism seemed to decrease after the evil empire disappeared, and also the technology of mass and political communication took a turn that made it possible for voices that would not be thought of as intellectual, nevertheless, to have a say. And then there are any number of events that occurred that we could discuss that kept the pot boiling. And there was also, and I guess I should mention it, and this is a kind of a long answer to your question, but one more thing to mention is that during that post-Reagan period, there have been all sorts of efforts to kind of redefine what conservatism means in the post-Reagan era. And we had the leave us alone conservatives, remember them back in the 90s, or maybe you don't, I don't. and the constitutional conservatives more recently, the compassionate conservatism. There were all these efforts to put adjectives in front of the word conservative, and that was partly because the word is getting to seem to exemplify stodginess or maybe something worse. And so people like Bush II came along and said, well, I'm a compassionate conservatism. Well, that was, I think, partly aimed at Gingrich, who seemed to have a more confrontational style of conservatism. And so we go and we have the Tea Party conservatives and the crunchy cons and the Theo-cons and the Leo-cons, the Leo Strauss. You have East Coast Straussians, West Coast Straussians. So part of that was a deliberate attempt to find a new fusionism, if you will, for a new era, but it also showed the risks, because factions were defining themselves against other factions more, and that made it harder to have this sense of common purpose. And anyway, that probably is enough said on that, but those are some of the things that have happened since the 90s. And it became, I think there's something to be said for the proposition that conservatism became more formulaic. It's just slogans. We believe in limited government. And what does that mean, maybe to your average voter, so to speak, who isn't thinking about these topics all day long? Well, what does that mean? What does that mean to me, my wallet, my children? How does conservatism relate? And so there was I think a feeling that arose that the conservative establishment had gotten a little slothful over time, and it wasn't really speaking to the felt needs of people outside the Beltway and so forth. And then you have, I think, a very key moment of the rise and then the frustration of the Tea Party movement between 2009 and I'll say about 2016. And out of that sense of perceived blockage, that they didn't get a fair shake from the establishment in terms of funding of political funds for different candidacies and all that sort of thing, a great deal of bad blood arose, and a sense, which I could say more about, but there's a sense that somehow the conservative establishment was going through the motions, uttering cliches, but not accomplishing anything. Now, I happen to think that the Tea Party movement was probably overly optimistic in thinking what it could do to change those institutions quickly. But that did build up a kind of frustration, which I think helped to open the door to Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's
a feeling that our people in Washington have let us, the people, down. And he came and said, I'm with you. So that's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You correctly, I think, date Tea Party from like 2009 until 2016. But I remember the early days in the Tea Party. It just seemed there was a sort of vibe in the air, if you will, of a lot of this felt like pent up anger at the Bush administration. It wasn't just Obama. Yeah. It was some sort of a lid that was kept on populist rightward appeal, if you will. And it took a while to take shape. I appreciate you sketching the history like that. That's very useful. But I want to go back maybe a little bit further to when you began, because any listener to this podcast has heard me talk and guests talk about fusionism ad nauseum. So I'm not going to do the whole song and dance, but I do think it's necessary to at least bring up this point. There's a lot of individuals who are a little bit more on the pro dead consensus side, if you will, who would describe fusionism. Well, let me put it this way. I think there's an argument against fusionism that is kind of a sleight of hand. They would start off by essentially saying what you did at the end of the Cold War. There wasn't as much cohesiveness to keep together the anti-communists, the libertarians, the traditionalists. And that makes sense. I think it's just a natural fraying, if you will, of political interests if you have a shared enemy that no longer exists, or at least doesn't exist in the same sense. I think there was kind of an odd sense at the beginning of the Bush administration to sort of make counterterrorism sort of the new thing that holds us all together, but it didn't quite work the same way. But they would then go on to say, okay, so therefore all this thing ever was a political coalition of convenience. And my understanding of Frank Meyer is he's like, well, yeah, it is a political coalition, but it's more than that. It's an actual theoretical underpinning of order and liberty being mutually reinforcing. And that these things are not enemies of each other, but are actually one is necessary for the other. And so I think that's because I myself, I would call myself a fusionist who would also agree fusionism is suffering a great deal these days because the libertarians and the traditionalists and every ism, if you will, within the right has found a reason to go a separate way. And there is almost a need for a political coalition to bring us all together. But I think where I would differ from some argument against fusionism, I would say, well, it's not just a political coalition. I'm actually arguing there's something deeper. There's something intellectual. There's something, I think you had mentioned, and Frank Meyer had argued, at the foundation of American, of the founding father era of what they were even trying to restore. And so, and again, I don't know if there's so much a question embedded here. It's just, I wonder sometimes if those who are against the fusionist project are arguing in bad faith of ignoring the fact that it has intellectual scaffolding and instead just choosing to only see it as a political alignments out of convenience, if you will. Yeah. And if that's all it is, then why couldn't we reshuffle? Why can't we invite in working class Americans and redefine the right as sort of a workers' party, if you will, if all this is just a big coalition?
Well, I agree with you. And incidentally, there is a book forthcoming by someone whom I believe you recently interviewed, Stephanie Slade.
Yes.
And which is, I've read the book and have given it an endorsement, a blurb. And I think it's an excellent book.
No, I'll definitely have her on when I've got the review copy here, and I'll have her on to talk about it because she is excellent on this subject.
Yes. And I think she deeply believes that this is a theoretically coherent worldview. Now, not everyone would agree. If that were easily demonstrable, we wouldn't be having a conversation 75 years after Meyer formulated. He didn't, but I think there was a kind of a de facto acceptance of the point that while there might be what he would call different emphases along the spectrum, nevertheless, each needed the other. And the way I would put it is the libertarians and the traditionalists in particular, they acted as kind of checks on the excesses of the other. So the libertarians, with their emphasis on liberty, and Reagan was famously authoritative and vocal on that subject. He said, America is freedom. He said those exact words in his farewell address. So the libertarians emphasize that. And that perhaps keeps the traditionalists from going off into integralist territory or whatever and rejecting freedom as an organizing principle. And on the other hand, the libertarians were kept together from a few of them did go off into very doctrinaire and eccentric directions. And Buckley famously criticized that because he said this was undermining the necessity of having a government strong enough to win the Cold War. So you need a big defense establishment. And he would say defense is a proper role of the state. The pragmatic question then becomes how much do you spend on which weapons, et cetera, what are the circumstances? But in principle, national defense is a necessary part of a government that is meant to ensure the freedom of its citizens. So the way I've tried to put it in lectures sometimes is that each of these impulses, which if pursued to exclusively can lead to eccentric half-truths that masquerade as full truths. They have the totality of truth. But rather, if they are kept in what I think Donald Devine, noted conservative academic, has called creative tension, the enduring tension, that prevents some of these sort of heretical impulses to take things off the tracks. So that may not satisfy all who are looking for a perfect theoretical defense of fusionism, maybe, but it still is it's more than just a contrivance. It's more than just a marriage of convenience. And the way I would like to put it, as I have on other occasions, is this: if you ask conservatives at the grassroots, we get right down to it, what do you want? What do conservatives want? And I would say they would respond, well, I want to be free. I want myself, my family, my loved ones to be able to live virtuous, decent lives. And I want to live in a society in which I feel safe from foreign or domestic threat. Foreign threat being external threats like communism. Domestic might be crime or something like that, or social disorder. So if you think about that, what have I just said? Freedom, virtue, safety. Well, those correspond to the three major underpinnings of the conservative movement of the Reagan era and somewhat beyond, the libertarians, traditionalists, and the national security people. So I think that embedded in our hearts are these sometimes competing impulses and yearnings. I mean, I want to be free, but I also want to be safe, which means I've got to pay money to have taxes so that there's a police department, that sort of thing. We don't live in total freedom. We cannot have total safety, the safety of an oppressive state that prevents any libertarian or liberty-loving impulses to exist. And I think that if you look at it that way, I would say that there is a little bit of fusionism in all of us. And it may vary from individual to individual and from topic to topic, public policy to public policy, but still a prudent conservative, to use a favorite word of Russell Kirk, would recognize that those are all part of what it means to be human, and that a conservative who really recognizes that has to have prudence as a kind of attitude toward how to bring those desiderata about. And so Frank Meyer may or may not have he didn't convince everybody at the time that or later that this was a theoretical proposition. It was irrefutable, like geometry or something like that. Nevertheless, it was more than just well, you've got an enemy, I've got an enemy, let's get together. There was more to it than that at its best, because conservatism is not only the defense of liberty, it's also involves the defense of national security, national safety. And as the founding fathers so eloquently recognized, Washington among them at a number of occasions, a small r Republican form of government required a substratum of essentially religiously based faith and morality. Not that every founding father was an Orthodox Christian, and I'm not saying that the country was founded as a Christian nation, although it was a nation of Christians by and large, but it wasn't a confessional state that was being developed in that period. Nevertheless, they frequently spoke about the need for virtue to help us order our souls so that we would have the strength of character and ability to reason that would make us effective as citizens who are the ultimate givers of consent to our government, you see. So you need both. And I think the founders recognized that, and Meyer was correct in that way to recognize that that the founders had these viewpoints. So I think that fusionism then, broadly speaking, or what I have taken to calling the fusionist sensibility, is something critical to the success of conservatism as I've just tried to define it. And I know that fusionism as an ism excites some people and it annoys others. And it's a sort of a perpetual discussion topic. And it's come up a lot in the last few years because of the Trump phenomena and this sense that conservatism is going through a kind of identity crisis, and what are we going to do, and how do we balance the scales and so forth. So for a lot of reasons, there's this discussion of fusionism, but I don't think fusionism was some kind of just artificial contrivance to bring people together who don't belong in the same room. It hopefully would bring people together and recognize that they had a certain amount of common ground, and that was essential for effective political action and for effective defense of the country that we call home.
Yeah, I'm reminded of it. Jonah Goldberg talks often about how the necessity, if you're going to hold conservatism in mind, or at least the conservatism he's advocating, that you have to be a little bit comfortable with ambiguity. You have to be a little bit comfortable with the not so smooth edges around your ideas. Yeah. And I've wondered about that with something like fusionism. If it is, I'm someone who is that way. Burkean, Kirkian, if you will. I'm not looking for my political theory to look like geometry. I'm very suspicious of ideological, certainty, if you will. And so fusionism makes a lot of sense to me because it's kind of hard to defend. It gets a little messy. It's hard to get your arms around what exactly this is. Where's the beginning? Where's the ending? It shifts a bit. It's not something you can demonstrably prove just through argument to someone else. And I think that weds very nicely to my conservatism, if you will. I can't define what is the perfect political order or system, if you will, but that doesn't mean, we're without the ability to talk principle. And I like how you had said, I think it's true that we probably all have a bit of fusionism in our hearts, as sort of a balancing of needs and stuff. And as you say too, about the founders rightly talking about the need of civic and moral virtue for shared government, self-government to work. It occurs to me that there are an awful lot of things in our hearts that we humans share too that are not so good or virtuous, that can be stoked, that can map onto, the right is really good about, I think, showing all the ways in which various forms of the left do this. But this exists on the right too. I think there are forms of populism that say, you mentioned Reagan had kind of a soft populism that was more abstract. There's a lot of populism today that's not very soft and is not at all abstract. It's saying we, the people, meaning you, are the good guys, and then these people over here are the bad guys because of their skin color or because of who they voted for or any number of things. Yes. And so it's interesting because I often argue that I think a conservatism, again, as I'm defining it, because these words get real messy, as I try to define it, requires a sort of virtuous maturity, I guess I would say, that we all have within us virtuous desires and evil desires, but we have to, something's going to ping our heart in a certain way when the demagogue tickles our ears with things we want to hear. It is incumbent upon us to say, well, is this morally right? Is this sound? Is this just? Is this truthful, if you will? And I think there's versions of that on the left. I don't think we're ever on the right going to convince everybody on the left they're wrong, but I do want to be able to convince people on the left that they too have a responsibility to be morally virtuous and cautious about, what they're listening to. Again, it occurred to me, I don't know that there's any question here other than just when you'd spoke, it had given me a lot of thoughts to that. Maybe I would ask this then. It is my observation, and tell me if you disagree, that we're in a particularly perilous era in which much of what is offered on the right, and therefore what we would define as conservatism, say in the mainstream, in my view, is far more of this odious populism than the sort of fusionism or something that can map to sort of a deeper virtue. And it leaves me distraught, but also a little perplexed sometimes that I even find a need when someone asks what I believe, and I say I'm a conservative, to throw some, as you had mentioned earlier, put an adjective on it to try to clarify, well, I'm not like those people, right? And maybe the period we went through up through the 1980s or 90s was kind of a unique blip in history. Maybe this is more normal human. Would you think is that a fair statement? Are we in an era where the right is more given to sort of a non-virtuous, if you will, aspects of what pings in the human heart?
Well, I think that populism by its very nature is anti-institutional, anti-elite, and often demagogic and passionate. It often produces demagogues. For example, and it used to be a left-wing phenomenon in our country more than right-wing. When you think of Huey Long in the 1930s, probably the most famous populist, if you will, of the 20th century, and of Father Coughlin on the radio, and others. You can go. There was a populist movement, the People's Party, in the 1890s, but populism is a sense of this this uprising against the perceived excesses of governing establishments or elites who look down on the common people and so forth. That is an undercurrent in our politics. You can trace it back to maybe Andrew Jackson or even further back than that. But one thing that is one of the risk factors associated with populism is that it tends to talk about defending the people, but it's our people against some enemy. And that opens the door to what I would call tribalistic passions, which I think are running rampant at this time. And there is increasingly, in my view, over the last 10 or 15 years, a growth of, or a decline of the language of liberty in conservative circles and replacement of it by the language or rhetoric of war. And it's not just conservatives or on the right, it's on the left. And so we have this sense that each side is at the barricades. And there's a sense that the other side is not only wrong, but it's evil, it's dangerous. And now I subscribe to various sources for thinking in the day online, obviously ones like National Review, Wall Street Journal, and so on, but others. So I get quite a gamut, and my sense is on the left there is not only a loathing of the current president, but a fear of him and a sincere belief. Apparently, I don't think this is just tactical talk. A belief that he is an authoritarian in the making, and that we might be in danger of an election which will be contested in very unsettling ways. And on the right, there is a growing sense, I've sensed this particularly of late, that on the left, if the Democrats get back into power, they're talking of openly now, some of them, of packing the Supreme Court, of quickly making Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. states, which would give them, they think, 4 senators, which would make it very hard for the Republicans to ever get back a majority of the Senate. Various things are being floated. So what I see happening is this sense on each side that the other side has moved beyond the legitimacy of traditional give and take political battling. And there was some strong political battling. Continetti could tell us in his book, and has, and as we know from our own studies and reading, that the rhetoric was pretty heated in the 30s, especially on the right, claiming that Roosevelt was moving well beyond the traditional norms and was pushing us toward a kind of socialist state. And I could quote you some of Hoover's speeches on this. So this is not the first moment in American history when we've had heated political rhetoric, but it may be one that is the first moment. It is one that more than at any other moment in American history, the heatedness is with us 24/7, and we hear it and don't only read it. Someone asked me recently, there have been other times in American history where we've had this kind of polarization. Well, in 1940-41, there was a huge national debate about whether we should intervene in World War II before Pearl Harbor, and how much we should aid Britain and so on, and risk the possibility of being dragged into the war. That was a period of intensive public debate, and the stakes seemed very high. A war, a big war, a world war. And they were resolved by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and the public was brought together overwhelmingly at that point in favor of obviously involvement in the war. But when I think of that, though, there was radio to some extent. It was in American households. But now we have what is, I think, a very psychologically unsettling media environment. Now, I'm on Twitter, but only to the point of not posting anything myself. I just want to get access to what some of my friends are saying, and I find it useful. But there are Twitter wars, as we know, and the quality of public discourse at X, on X and elsewhere is something that would have been would have seemed almost impossible 20 years ago, what we now allow in the way of name calling and so forth. So, in other words, the passions are there. They've been high at other times in our history. 1860, 61, is the greatest example of that. But what is different now is that there is this kind of mobilization through cyberspace and through radio and so on, and both sides participate in this. And what we've had, I believe, is a kind of hollowing out of the sense that there is a center left and a center right, and then there are those extremes out there. So if you are on the center right or the center left, by the center left, I might say the Free Press, Barry Weiss's newspaper's got a couple million members. I'm a member. I subscribe. Or the center right, Mike Pence perhaps comes to mind, or a certain McConnell, and so on. But that seems to be shrinking. And what we have here is, and it's the same pattern in some certain European countries where the center cannot hold or is having difficulty holding the center left and the center right because of more passionate and harsher factions farther to the left and farther to the right. So it would seem that at this point in time, the Democrats' energy is so anti-Trump now that it is willing to contemplate policy outcomes that are going to upset and frighten people on the right, so that each is going to see the election of the other side as a kind of existential threat. That's a term that's thrown around. It may not be. There are 330 million people, and not all of us are watching these debates online all the time. But we have so much built into our public discourse system that it is unsettling, perpetually unsettling, I think. And I don't know how that is going to work itself out. But I do think that one of the problems of populism, it usually arises from some genuine grievance, I would say. And that grievance needs to be addressed by those who are perceived as not having addressed it very much in the past. And the Europeans in Denmark and elsewhere are going through this process on the issue of mass immigration. And it's a very delicate issue, and that could be a subject of a long colloquy here. But it's not unique to the United States. But I do worry that populism, unless it's somehow to make the system work, there has to be some accommodation, reasonable accommodation of the grievances of the aggrieved. But if the grievances get to the point of saying the other side is out to get us, and the other side is authoritarian, dangerous, radical, socialist, whatever, then it's going to be hard to reduce the passions and to have any kind of functioning government from the center. So I think that it's in a sense it's a two-front war that the center right and the center left are trying to conduct here against those who would define their sides of the spectrum in increasingly extreme manners.
As you're taking it occurred to me I agree that there needs to be some accommodation for the aggrievements, if you will, of a populist voice. I think what we're suffering from today is not a good faith effort to accommodate, but rather a desire to stoke the populist hatred for political purposes, which is not an accommodation of their grievances. It's more of a give us more power and we're just going to keep pushing this button to make you angrier and angrier. Let me in way of, since our time is limited, let me in way of a closing section, if you will. Yes. And I recognize this is entirely unfair to ask of anyone, but we all sit here and think, gosh, what's going to happen in the future, right? Where's all this going? So I'd asked you, we talked about since 1945 up through the 80s, and then you kind of helped chart that 40-year gap between the 80s and where we're at today. But it again, as Jonah Goldberg often says, Donald Trump is not going to be president forever, whether electorally or through the actuary tables. At some point, he's not going to be on the scene. Now, granted, a person cannot be on the scene and they still leave a lasting mark decades after they've gone too. But I think there just seems to be such a latent tension within the right of what happens next, who takes up the mantle, what groups come next. And I'm not necessarily asking you to predict the future per se, but I'm curious what your thoughts are as to I will call them the various possibilities. Which potential groups do you see as perhaps ascendant? I'm not necessarily asking you to name names that would fit with them, other than just for purposes of clarifying what these groups might believe. But where do you see things going?
Well, I think we're still in a period of turbulence and attempted reconfiguration or redefinition of the right. Until a few months ago, it seemed that the nationalist populist groups were ascendant, and there was the whole Hungarian connection, which now seems to be severed with the defeat of Orban. And what I have sensed, and it may be based on incomplete evidence, I don't know, but this is my sense of things, is that there has been a certain tendency now on the right for people who are outside the nationalist populist camp or the post-liberals, that group, to reorganize and redefine conservatism in a way that's more congruent with the older Reaganite broad tent formulations that we've talked about already. And for example, there's a group now called Freedom Conservatism. One of the leaders is Avik Roy, I believe.
I've had him on the podcast, actually.
Oh, have you? Oh, well, okay.
Yeah.
I'll go back and watch that. So they may not be as numerous. I don't know. I can't measure their influence, but there are quite a few who are saying, look, we are not defined quite the way that our opponents on the right are trying to define conservatism. So that's one group. And there's a kind of an online magazine called Fusion. It's published, I think, by the American Institute for Economic Research now up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, about 60 miles from where I live. And it has had a kind of a libertarian history, the AIER, but it seems to be trying to have a kind of a fusionist opening there. And these are some signs that not everybody is on the same wavelength now, and that there are other groups who are going to try to redefine. Now, I think it would be utopian to expect that these other groups would come along and say, we simply erase the last 10 years and we go back to some kind of good old days. I don't think history works by that. So what is likely to happen is attempts to define Trumpism after Trump. And of course, already the people inside the Beltway and so forth are trying to figure out, is it Rubio, is it Vance, who's going to be, those seem to be the two most prominent administration figures. It's very difficult after a figure like a Trump or FDR earlier on to go forward. You can't simply replicate the personality. And whoever runs in 28, if Trump is there to be on the scene, I suspect he's going to be very involved in one way or another. It's not in his nature to sit in the sidelines. And that will complicate things for the putative successor, each of whom, whether it's whether it's Rubio or Vance or someone else conceivably, but they seem to be the two with the inside prospects at this point. It's going to be hard for them to define themselves in a way that makes them look new somewhat, and yet respectful of and in continuity with their boss. You see, they can't reject populism. This is the issue that Hubert Humphrey had in 1968 when he was running as the incumbent vice president whose leader, Lyndon Johnson, was unpopular, especially with the Democratic liberal base, and Hubert Humphrey was trying to be his own man, and yet he couldn't be too much his own man because he could alienate some of Johnson's residual following. So it's a tricky thing for a successor. So I assume that whoever gets the nomination would have some new program or whatever, something fresh that makes him look like not just a robotic imitator of Trump and Trumpism. And I don't myself think that Trumpism is a coherent ideology. Trump has a number of very strong attitudes that go back well into his early adulthood, particularly his dislike of what he calls other countries ripping us off, and his willingness or eagerness to use some kind of punitive tactic like tariffs to even the scales and so forth. So there are impulses in Trump's view of the world that I think are constants, but I don't think it adds up to a particularly coherent ideology. In fact, his worldview seems to be that we don't look at the world in terms of right and wrong. We look at the world in terms of weak and strong. And Trump, I think, wants his own sphere of influence, particularly in this hemisphere, whether it's Greenland or Venezuela or whatever is on his mind. You see and I think he's probably willing to concede to Xi and in China and to Putin a kind of control of their spheres of influence. A very old-fashioned way of looking for it, and not very congruent, I think, with the Reaganite period of the Cold War. But then maybe I'm digressing. But I think, in the course of giving you this response, indicating some of the pitfalls and some where there are difficulties that are going to face anyone trying to succeed Trump and be somewhat independent of him, but not repudiating of him, which would be very difficult politically. And I'll leave you with this thought too. One of the problems that I have seen, I think, since the beginning of the Trump administration, the first term and now the second term, is that he has a remarkable ability to dominate the news. He's his own best advertiser, but he's not his own best advocate. And I think Rubio, in some ways, is a better advocate for him on foreign policy than he is. And not only that, but Trump has never succeeded in really having majority support from the American people in his presidency. I think in his first term, he never got a 50% approval rating in the consolidation of all the polls. Once or twice, I think the Rasmussen poll had him 52%, or just barely. So he never really had majority support, which is unprecedented in the history of polling since the 1930s. Usually at some point, a president is popular, if only on day one, to give the guy a chance, that sort of impulse. So right now, he appears to be very popular with his base, but the base is not expanding. So the way I would put it is that he has intensified his support within his base, witness his power in recent primaries and so forth. But at the same time, he's not expanding his base. And that then where can that be done? And that's going to be a challenge for whoever succeeds him. And the hope would be, I suppose they would hope to win back some of the never Trumpers, or those who are very reluctant Trumpers, but they don't like the Democrats, so therefore they'll vote Republican. So right now, I think what's going to happen immediately, I think we're already seeing this, is there's just going to be this fantastically bitter, very noisy election campaign with lots and lots of money on both sides to advertise and so forth, with the sense being projected that this is an apocalyptic election, an apocalyptic moment, an existential crisis. So you will see perhaps a phenomenal turnout from those who are anti-Trump. And part of his challenge is to bring out a comparable turnout from people, many of whom are not historically Republican by identification. So Trump has to bring out those sorts of people. So it's a kind of mobilization of each tribe to get more and more votes, and that generates further or intensifies further these impulses that I described earlier of these tribalistic passions. So I don't see a lessening of the passion anytime soon, nor even in 2028, when there will be this great moment for whoever emerges to try to set the country either in a somewhat same direction with a Republican, but not too Trumpian, lest you scare away some of the disdainful anti-Trump people. And on the other side, the Democrats are going to be sorely tempted to make it an all-out attack on everything Trumpian. But at the same time, they may overplay their hand and cause some people in the center to be nervous. Well, if they're going to go that far to the left, is that what I want? So each party is going to point to the perceived excesses and risks of the other, and that's very negative. It doesn't make for what you and I might want in terms of high-level public policy discussion. But I think those are some of the dynamics, and I don't pretend to be a predictor, but I don't foresee, or perceive rather, any clearing of the political landscape or the political weather report, so to speak, given this moment that we're in. But you are right in what you said initially in your question, Josh, and that is that Trump will not be on the political scene always. And there will be those who will try to imitate, those who will try to modify, and so forth. And there may be more of an attempt. I'm not sure it will succeed, but there will be an attempt by the sort of residual Reaganite conservatives, the fusionists, and so forth, to say that the party has to go back to its roots. And maybe one last thing I should say on that point. I'm not sure that all this chatter that occurs inside the Beltway, inside the media universe on X and all of that sort of thing, how much of that really gets down to the grassroots? It obviously does in some voting situations, as we've seen in recently, in maybe tonight in Texas, as we speak. There might be more stirring at the grassroots than we think. But I sense that there is still in the American psyche a kind of a 4th of July patriotic view of America that's strong on the conservative side. And I think that in some ways we are fortunate as a country to have the 250th anniversary occurring when it is. That doesn't produce political tranquility necessarily, but it does cause us all, on whatever side of the spectrum we may be, to think about our past, our founding, and what threatens it, what is good about it, what is to be preserved. It puts us into a frame of thinking about some of the more precious parts of our inheritance. So maybe through all this celebration and so on, and even debate about the meaning of the Declaration, that's a whole intramural debate in certain corners of the right now. You see, some of that will reach to a higher level, and that maybe we'll come out feeling a little bit better about our society and our history than it sometimes seems that we feel at this moment. So I'm hopeful that this whole 4th of July revisiting of America's heritage and roots and principles and ideals, that will have some positive impact on us as a civil society.
One last question, if I may.
Sure.
You have been around for a long time. You've seen a lot, and you've been a great observer of American, conservatism, but I would just say American politics in action. I think you've given us an excellent summary of what a lot of us, let's say the exhausted majority, are feeling with our politics. If we're speaking, this is a podcast for millennials and hopefully younger Americans too. And if we're speaking to that group, because I think there's a lot of understandable desire for sort of the utopic, well, by 2028, everything's going to snap back to some wonderful era where we can just put all this behind us. And then there's a lot of cynicism of like, it'll never change. It'll never be better. Yeah. But you've been around for a long time. You've seen things that us younger Americans have not seen. What is the cause for hope, if you will? What is I'm not talking about 2028. I'm not talking about the next election. I just mean as a sense of decency in government. Let's put it that way. We can even strip conservatism out of it. Elected officials that we can be proud of with integrity, a sort of a not what we currently have. Is there a reason to say, what, conservatism has conserved things? Fusionism does work. These things do, in fact, work, and they can be ascendant. There's a reason to go on fighting, even if at the moment there's no clear path from where we're at to where we want to go. What would you say to a person who is needing hope right now?
Well, take a long view. The United States has existed now as an independent entity for 250 years. It has gone through periods of strife that could have dissolved the Union, could have led to poor outcomes in certain wars and so forth. So the fact that we have survived, and with a kind of still, I think, instinctive veneration of the founders as people who really were remarkable and who far-sighted, that should give us some hope. I think that I would agree with a friend who said recently he thought that one of the most hopeful signs for America right now is the homeschooling movement. Well, obviously that affects only a small percentage of the total student population, but in the homeschooling environments, there is a great deal of attention, I think, as a generalization, being paid to the history of the United States taught not as simply the history of mistakes and errors and slavery and so on, but a society which gives people something precious. And it's the word is freedom, as Reagan said it. And I think there's been too much of a tendency to disparage that term currently, or not emphasize it enough, and talk about what we want is power. We want power to make big changes in Washington, or to whatever, punish our enemies, do this or do that. It seems to me that we need to reflect on what our blessings are, if you will. And America and freedom can sound like a very trite word, and maybe an abstract word, is maybe to people who are just starting out in their adult part of their lives. It may seem rather tepid, and yet think about it. I mean, we have religious freedom in this country. We do have political freedom in this country, freedom of speech, freedom of travel. You and I and any of those folks listening to this, we can hop on a plane if we have the money and go somewhere in the world tomorrow. No one is telling us we have to have a passport and so forth, but that's pretty much procedural. No one is denying us the freedom to travel, the freedom to change jobs, to freedom. I live in Massachusetts. I could move to California, or if I were younger, I'd be tempted to move to near the Hoover Institution and so on. Which is a wonderful place. I spent a lot of time there doing research. It's an extraordinary think tank, but enough said on that as a little digression. But I think we tend to take for granted too much what we have been bequeathed, and that I don't mean we have to be rosy, sort of overly idealistic. There are troubles in lots of situations, of wokeness, persecution of certain minorities in different situations. And yet America's had this ability to correct itself, and it has aspirations that are embedded in our founding documents. And we should just remember that and attend some celebrations come the 4th of July, even if it's just watching fireworks go off. There's a reason for this. And I'm hoping that this moment can be a teaching moment and a learning moment for many people as we think about our society. And one thing that's been under attack a lot, and we haven't talked about in quite these terms in this discussion, but is that the American civil religion has been under stress for some time. The civil religion arguing that America is a land of freedom, it's a land of opportunity, and the tendency has been to embrace what has been called the culture of repudiation. Anything in the past, well, it's tarred by something or other. There's greed or enslavement of minorities, and things that happened. Certainly, I'm not saying that those can be overlooked or swept away, but we have, I think, made some gains in making this not just a land of opportunity in theory, but in practice. And so my earnest hope is that young people will not simply get into this habit of saying, well, yeah, the so-and-so, well, we know George Washington owned slaves, or we know that Lincoln had a certain weakness, or whatever. You can look at any public character and find something that's less than perfect, I suppose, about them. Sort of the muckraking impulse, which I think has gotten far too prevalent in our general thinking about our past. And I'm not saying that we have to simply wave the flag. I'm not calling for that, but I'm calling as a historian for a more balanced understanding and a recognition that we live in a moment in which we have incredible opportunities. And so often, as I said just a moment ago, it seems like that just is not part of the consciousness enough of younger people. So I hope that whether through this conversation or through reading or celebration or whatever that comes along in the next few months and beyond, that young people and old can say, well, we're proud to be Americans, for at least we know we're free, the Lee Greenwood song. And so again, without becoming boastful or arrogant or pompous about such things, or trying to tell the whole world that they've got to live just like us and so forth. We have to be somewhat restrained and measured, but I think we can properly be grateful And I think that's part of the conservative frame of mind, to be grateful for the blessings that have occurred through the tribulations and endeavors and sacrifices of the generations that have come before us, so that we can take our part as our turn comes. Well, I'm a little older than the people we're talking about here, but anyway, there are still opportunities in this land, and we should not just disparage them or forget them, but to be, as I say, grateful that we are Americans and that we are living in a land that still is in many ways a beacon to the world. So I will close my little sermon on that note.
Dr. Nash, I have profited greatly from your writings and deeply enjoyed this is the third time we've had you on the podcast, and I've enjoyed every one of our conversations. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Josh. It's been a pleasure as always. I wish you all the best as you start your 9th year of this kind of educational process for the millennials and others.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.